My name is Santilla Chingaipe and I am a journalist with SBS World News. I would like to welcome you to the Wheeler Centre's very first Africa Talk series on identity, and it should be a very exciting topic to discuss. And obviously identity is something that we all deal with within our lives, no matter what your background is. We're all trying to figure out where we're from and where we belong and what does that mean to us. But tonight we'll be exploring that through the African-Australian experience. What does that mean? Who is an African-Australian? Is it based on colour? Is it religious? Is it geographical? And I've got a couple of people with me tonight to help me flesh it out. And immediately next to me is Kirk Zwangobani.
Yeah.
And Kirk was born and raised in Canberra, where he now lives and works, and is an executive teacher. And Kirk is an early career researcher who has theorised extensively on the formation of an African-Australian identity and belonging. Please welcome Kirk. And next to Kirk is Soreti Kadir, and she is of Oromo heritage, but has spent most of her life living in Melbourne. She's one of the co-founders of In Our Own Words, an NGO focused on self-awareness and community empowerment amongst the African diaspora. Please make Soreti feel welcome. And lastly, Monica Forson is of mixed Ghanaian and Australian heritage, and she's a co-founder and president of the Afro-Australian Student Organisation, a member of the Multi-Faith Multicultural Youth Network, and she's also a youth advisor of the Ghanaian Association of Australia. Okay. So before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet tonight, the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. Okay, so African-Australian identity. I guess my first question is for you, Kirk, because out of all the bios, you were the only one that didn't identify yourself. So I'm curious to know, how do you identify?
Great. Good question to start with. It's a tricky one, I guess, because, like you said yourself, identity is a fairly sort of difficult space to work in. I was at a conference a few years ago at an African Studies Association conference, and I was given a paper, and it was quite a difficult paper because I was discussing the differences between being born here and then being sort of transnational, that moving back and forth between Australia and Zimbabwe, and being steeped, what I called at the time, in white culture, for use of a better term, sort of being raised or born and bred is what I put it as sometimes here in Australia, but then also travelling back and forth. And I sort of got harangued at the end of my paper by a gentleman at the back of the room who was a colleague, someone I knew. But his question to me was, what are you? Are you African or are you Australian? And I had no response, because it was a really difficult one to sort of to contextualise and to really sort of have to, as soon as you choose one, you sort of almost automatically dismiss another one. And so I guess that's why I started, even with my research, adopting the term African Australian, just purely to be able to explore what is that identity. And, as someone who was born here and has been witness to the ongoing migration since the 70s, I had to sort of ask myself, well, can we use this African Australian identity, and is it something that I can now lay claim to? Because there's a diaspora here in Australia and there's a significant population. Is it something that I can actually hang my hat on? Still haven't gotten to that point.
Yeah, so what do you do when people ask you where you're from?
Well, a friend of mine said to me the other day, actually, she said, do you ever get asked if you're Indigenous? Because I grew up here in the 70s and the 80s, and funnily enough, I never have been, which I thought was quite surprising. I guess my routine response was always quite standard. I was born here, but my father is Zimbabwean. And that's something I sort of stuck to for quite a long period of time. And I think it's only maybe the last decade, thankfully, a bit less than that people have stopped asking. So it's actually been quite fortuitous that I actually don't have to adopt this position, but I can actually sort of just be quite relaxed. And if it comes out in the conversation later, that's fine and that's all good. But I sort of seem to thankfully gravitate in where I avoid being hit straight up as to as you've done today, as to who are you, where do you come from, sort of type exercise. So that's a very circular way of avoiding your question.
Yeah.
But it sort of just shows you there's a few points where I think during my life I've had to just adopt different identities really to sort of adjust to what the sort of political context is of the day more than anything. And African Australian is probably the most recent and newest one, and I guess that's what led me to start theorising upon it, because it was something that was suddenly new in this space in Australia.
What about for you, Soreti? Do you see yourself as an African Australian?
It's an interesting term, I think, it's a term that I've only really come across in the last, I would say, 2 years in becoming really involved in the broader African community, not just the Oromo community, because I've been working in the Oromo community since I was really, really young. And for me, I feel like I wasn't born here. I was born in Oromia, and I came here when I was I was 2, and I've spent my entire life here. And my entire life in trying to construct some kind of solid form or idea of identity for myself, I've always tried to strive for what I interpreted as being an Australian identity. And I thought that in order to do that, I had to distance myself from my Oromo identity, so my African identity. And so that was a real struggle growing up. And it wasn't until very recently that for myself, that journey has kind of taken another direction in trying to understand, in the context of talking about African Australian identity, what does that Australian actually mean? I feel like when you're a migrant or a refugee and you are asked to, identify with an Australian identity, a lot of the time that Australian, name or concept doesn't include the entirety of Australia's society. It includes a very certain part of Australian society and, like you said, a white culture. And I feel like for me, what I am trying to develop for myself is a linkage between my African identity, and if there is to be a relationship between that and my Australian identity, I would like that to come in the form of a relationship with Australia's Indigenous community. And I feel like in terms of the way the Oromo diaspora is set up, or general African diasporas are set up, there's very little acknowledgement of that part of Australia's history or present or future or current. And so that's something for myself I think I'm trying to foster. And it's been difficult because I feel like there's very limited resource that is accessible for migrant enclaves that are created in Australia or diaspora groups to access. And so for myself, when I use the term African, I actually don't use the term African Australian full stop. I never have, and I don't think it's something that I will. I identify as an Oromo living in the Oromo diaspora and the African diaspora living in Australia.
Yep. Can you just explain Oromo for people that might not understand where Oromo is?
Yeah, I'm sorry, yeah. The Oromo people are indigenous to Ethiopia. And so in terms of a people who are striving for self-determination in a political, social and economic sense, for me, living in the diaspora, the least I can do is identify as Oromo over Ethiopian, which is why I call myself Oromo. There is a huge Oromo community, by the way, in Melbourne.
Yes, there is. And Monica, for you, what does that identity mean for you, African Australian? Do you identify as African Australian?
I think I do. I know that when I was younger, I really did, because I was just very black and white, 50-50. I'm like, I'm African Australian. And then as I got older and I saw more Sudanese refugees arrive in Melton, where I'm from, I'm like, oh, I look a little bit different to like the other Africans. And I started to change what I thought I was a little bit. So I think as being mixed race, you're always trying to identify yourself and try to fit into a box as such, because a lot of the time you're left out of the box. And a lot of African people are like, oh, are you black or are you white? Or like, are you African or whatever? I'm like, I don't know yet. Like, I don't think I should have to make that decision. I don't think someone else should be trying to get me to figure out who I am or what I am. But I know that my mum was really adamant about us understanding our Ghanaian culture as well as our Anglo-Australian culture. And like, I know where my dad's from. I know that we're from Takoradi. I know that we're in Zimmer and we're Fanti. I know the village that we're from, and I know the rich cultural heritage from where I'm from. And yeah, I just feel like I'm a mix of two.
I was talking to Kirk before when we were discussing, the pilgrimage that you make as a African child that's raised in Australia, and your parents take you to Africa, or you're immersed in that culture. Do you think that is part of cultivating that identity? And does it play any role in that?
I think,
Any one of you can answer that.
when I went back to Ghana, it felt really good. It felt, I don't know, it's kind of like a surreal feeling to know that your family's from there. So I love that, and I was kind of envious of other African people that could more readily access that sort of heritage and stuff. So when I went there, I was like, I want to learn everything about my family and whatnot. But yeah.
I think it was, so I've been back 3 times in moving to Australia, and my family, actually my immediate family, live in Oromia, so I'm here with my extended family, and for me it was interesting. I've seen differences in my identification with Ethiopia, with Oromia, whatever, it's changed in my life, what I've called it, as I've gotten older. I think when I went back when I was 16, I was still really, really bitter in accepting the fact that I was a Black African woman, and so going back wasn't very pleasant, because it was re-emphasizing to me who I was, what I wanted to ignore. And I felt like when I came back, it became harder to then continue to condition myself in thinking otherwise. When I went back when I was 18, I felt like I had missed out on quite a lot, and so I was really eager to catch up on this immersion that I had felt like I had missed over the last 2 trips that I had taken. So it's been a bit of both, but I do believe that the last time that I was there, and I was there for about 3 months, and I was also in Kenya for a while as well, it was extremely, extremely humbling, and I think I learned a lot about who I was, about my history, about everything that created the diaspora that I was from, and the differences. And I think also being a member of the diaspora and going back to wherever African country you're from, there's already a certain category just for you as a person from the diaspora. You're a different kind of foreigner. You look like me, but you're really a foreigner. And so trying to dismantle that as well was quite interesting, difficult, whatever you want to use.
Okay, so I guess on a similar context, my trajectory is probably a bit longer, due to the benefit of age. So when I first went over, it was 1983, so it's probably about 11, so now you can all do the maths, but anyway. So for me, it was quite not confronting, but I knew of the family in Zimbabwe, but hadn't actually been there. And it was just after independence, and I did put in one paper that, like, for me, I think the main thing I remember, besides going up into the cockpit of a Qantas aeroplane, was when I stepped off the tarmac in Harare, and there was just this black population, and that was something I'd never experienced in Australia, obviously, as a young person. So that for me was a significant shift in the way that I actually understood myself, my family, just, I guess, my existence really as a young person. And I think that at that stage, with my brother and sister and my mother, we spent about 3 months living there. Now, again, like you were saying, you have to negotiate, is not being from the country of origin or from Africa, and then there's sort of this ongoing negotiation, I guess. And a memory that came to mind is when I was at school, because I went to school in Harare for a little while, and the kids there used to pick on me, the local kids, and call me a gollywog. And I was totally perplexed, because I've come from this culture where I would get called a gollywog by white kids, and then I go to Zimbabwe and get called a gollywog by black kids, and I'm just sort of stuck in between, and I'm just sort of like, this is difficult. So I guess that sort of goes to the heart of the matter, that you're constantly negotiating between these two spaces, in this sort of what we might call a transnational space, if you like, that you're moving between these two continents. And then I think for about another 10 years, every couple of years, I'd just go across and visit family. And again, it just became this constant negotiation. But I think I got to the point in the early 20s where it did actually become home and did become family. And as we were talking backstage, I sort of lost a bit of that attachment to Australia and nationality, and I sort of realised that we are in this sort of more fluid space. And I guess that's what I was alluding to before with identity, that it wasn't really I could suddenly just align and say I'm Zimbabwean, or I could say I'm Australian, because you're really sort of always negotiating between these different existences. But when I lived there for a year or so in my early 20s, that really cemented for me as that has been part of my cultural makeup and my heritage. And the family, given the language wasn't my language, and I couldn't speak Ndebele or Shona, but it really just actually grew and cemented in myself that was actually part of who I was and my belonging, so to speak. And then I didn't actually go back for 20 years until a couple of months ago, because my grandfather passed away. and it was very difficult for anyone in the family to go back. So there's this big gap in between of 20 years where I was sort of establishing a home and family and career, etc. And that really cemented for me when I went back a couple of months ago that things hadn't really changed, and that was still inherent to who I was, and it wasn't a challenge, and I didn't feel like an outsider. And I went back for the funeral, which goes on for several days, and family, and I guess my benefit is that my family. My father had lived overseas and travelled overseas, obviously, and they were used to this part of this Australian side of the family, so to speak. So for me, it hasn't changed, and it's become quite inherent. And the negotiation side of it now has sort of diminished. Now I sort of see that both elements, both countries, etc., are part of who I am. But I still think there's the negotiation in terms of other people understanding that. Because I still think a lot of people are quite well grounded in their countries of origin, and we are fortunate because we're having this discussion and we're in this sort of space where we're negotiating between these different cultures. But I think it's quite hard for other people sometimes to understand that, and to understand that you haven't been somewhere for 20 years, but that's still as much part of your home, and you still have those connections, be they spiritual, religious, or whichever, with your family, where a lot of people are used to a nuclear family, especially in a country like Australia, where they see their family quite often. So for me, the negotiation comes now with other people understanding that, and understanding that the differences.
Do you think that's part of the reason why perhaps some members of the African Australian community, and by African Australian, I'm sort of trying to covering the Black African Australian community. We'll touch on the other African Australian communities as well. Do you think that perhaps plays a factor into how they identify towards Australian identity? That connection to where their parents are from, that heritage, that perhaps helps them navigate that.
Yeah, I guess for me, if I just switch to my research hat for a minute, I guess like I did ethnography with a lot of young people, probably about your age, for quite a while, for about 8 years or so, just doing this ethnographic research. And part of it was with young people that were born here and how they negotiated their identity, how they determined, and where they, what side of the fence they sat on, if you like. What I found complex was that young people that were born here, but they wanted to identify as African Australian, but then they just didn't understand or know that much of their African, be it Nigerian or Eritrean or the like. The rituals, the traditions, the family, they'd spent most of their life here, and so they didn't feel like they could make claim to having that as part of their actual cultural makeup. But at the same time, purely by colour of skin or language or the like, they knew that in this white Australian culture that they couldn't quite align completely with that either. So I think for young people, trying to actually broker between those two spaces is very difficult. It was easier for the people in my study that had actually arrived recently to Australia, but more of an economic migrant, as opposed to refugee humanitarian, and that they were quite firm, they were really wedded to the African continent, and that was their identity, and then they would just negotiate into the Australian landscape as part of how they would fit into the Australian and into the Australian society. So I found their identities were much more stable and concrete, and they were African first and foremost, or Nigerian, Eritrean, etc. But those that were born here really struggled to conceptualise and to be quite stable in who they were, and struggled in terms of that sense of where they belonged and how they could identify. Is for the better part what my research revealed in the early stages.
Do you think that cultural differences and race plays a part to that identity of feeling like you are Australian, as in, if you are a white African, whose parents migrated to Australia and you were born here, perhaps because people can't necessarily identify you as an African from your appearance, you navigate that slightly better than someone who is mixed race like yourself, or like Monica, that your skin colour sort of reminds everyone like, hang on, you're a little bit different.
I'd say that for a lot of that negotiation, like some of the girls that I worked with that were of mixed heritage, they'd get teased by some of their friends that were newly arrived Africans as being token white, for example. So I think it doesn't matter if you're white, black, or in between. I think that colour does always play some sort of role in that negotiation. I think white Africans that come to Australia and have to negotiate those boundaries, or I'll put it another way, and another boy that I worked with in Zimbabwe who, for me, he understood the post-colonial context, growing up in a colonised country, but it was British run, etc. And I found, working with him in the study, that he really could negotiate the cultural norms of Australia because he understood that context of a sort of post-colonial society. And so I would say it wouldn't really matter. It's not so much, it's as much as it may be colour, I think it's also what your experiences that have occurred in that country of origin that might lend themselves to actually be negotiating your identity in a place like Australia. So if this young boy was white and he came to Australia, again, the cultural norms and the post-colonial structures of society, I think, lend themselves for him to be able to negotiate his identity in a place like Australia more easily than if he came from, let's say, Ethiopia or perhaps possibly West Africa, where it's a different cultural makeup in terms of the way society is structured. So I think the colour does obviously play a role, and especially when we face racism in Australia, based on colour primarily. So, but I still think that it has a lot to do with your experiences in the home country.
Yeah. I'll come over to you, Monica and Soreti. I'm curious to figure out how, amongst your peer group, you navigate that identity. Do you see yourselves as Australian, or do you always have to prefix it with something, Oromo or Ghanaian? And do you think you will ever get to a point where you just simply call yourselves Australian, full stop?
Do you want to go first?
Personally, and also in the circles I feel like I revolve around in, the young people of African background who I'm around, I don't think that would ever be the case where we'd come to a place where, full stop, we are Australian, for a couple of reasons. I think for myself, my national identity is Australian by citizenship, but in terms of my national allegiance, I think that still very much lies with being Oromo. I think that's because of the way the Oromo diaspora is set up, not only in Australia but worldwide. I've always, not always, I think for a long time, from about the age of 13 to 17, heavily involved in the Oromo diaspora here. And sometimes it can almost make you feel as if you were never really taken from home because you were constantly amongst what is now replicating that home. And then, in the last couple of years, I felt a huge connection and a huge, community amongst the global Oromo diaspora, especially last year with a lot of the campaigns that were orchestrated amongst people from across the world of Oromo background. And so I feel like my national identity, although in written form is Australian, I don't feel like my personal allegiance or my personal affiliation lies there. In terms of, and also I feel like I very heavily identify with the global Black diaspora, and in terms of a lot of the work that I want to focus on, or I am focusing on, is about looking at ways in which the Black diaspora, in every facet of that Blackness, whether it is African Blackness or other Indigenous Blackness, can find ways to commune and communicate and unite, and look at ways in creating pathways that give other Africans or Black people the opportunity to navigate that Blackness. And so I don't identify, culturally, I don't identify as Australian. Linguistically, I identify as, I speak English, but I also really speak...
accent.
Pardon? The accent, yeah. I think it's more so how people identify me. Personally, if I'm to talk about how I identify as an Oromo living in the Oromo diaspora. Then at other times I identify as a Black woman living in the Black diaspora. But other people identify me as being an African Australian based on the way that I speak, based on where I live, and based on where I came from. And so that construction of identity really doesn't have much to do with how I want to be identified. It's more so the way, what makes others, what makes me more negotiable for others, what makes me more understandable for others, and how do they want to digest all of this, It has very little to do, I feel like, with what I identify as or want to identify as being. But if, directly asked, if directly put in a situation where I had to converse around this topic, in my mind, it's extremely clear.
Okay. Monica?
It's hard to follow from that. I would love to get to a point where I'm just considered Australian, where a white person doesn't ask, but where are you really from? Or just ask those extra questions. I think it was easier to identify being Australian when I travelled overseas, because I was so used to saying, but my dad's from Ghana and my mum's Anglo-Australian, and that was always my answer to like, what am I? And then I went to France and I'm like, oh, I'm half Ghanaian. He's like, no, you're not, you're Australian. I'm like, oh, I always felt like I had to always say like extra stuff. And then also in America when I went to Harlem, and it felt really, really weird to see people of my same skin colour. And then I said, oh, I am Australian. And yeah, I think travelling abroad makes you realise that you are Australian, and the beliefs that you have and the customs that you share with others. Like, yeah, I just felt more Australian by being away from Australia, but which is a bit sad. But then when I do come here, I do feel like I do have to say like both sides, because I am like, I have to say, but then now I'm also I'm proud of both sides. So yeah, I'm still negotiating that. If you ask me next week, it might be a different answer. But at the moment, I'm happy with the two.
Okay, so, what about for other African Australians that are navigating these issues and might be second, third generation and don't have the luxury to travel and go overseas, and or that connection to culture that their parents might bring into the family unit? What sort of drivers to that national identity or that Australian identity do you think need to be in place in order to make them feel like they are part of Australia? Is that even possible?
Yeah.
I think the first question I ask myself, and I feel like the first question, a good starting place is, what is most important to you in a construction of self that you are happy with and you are content with, and what you can, I guess, what you are happy with, or at least what you can cope with in a social context. And so I feel like if you are of African background, diaspora, if I did not have the Oromo diaspora in Melbourne, I actually do not know where I would be today. And so I've known a lot of Oromos who, although the diaspora exists, have felt quite disconnected from it. I've not known has it existed in its wholeness or in how huge it is, and have grown up separate from that. But in coming in contact with that diaspora, have begun to know what questions to ask themselves in constructing an African Australian identity or some kind of identity that they are content with. And so I feel like if you are an African living in Australia, third, second generation, there more often than not, there will be a community that you can access. If there isn't, there are people that you can access who have probably navigated a similar journey or situation. And I feel like because I think you have to come to a point in knowing that you do want to solidify something for yourself. Because I was very content until the age of 17, cruising through life, having no idea who I was, what my skin color meant or anything. I was very happy with that. It's until you become unhappy with that instability, for lack of a better word, that you start looking for answers. And when you start looking for those answers, I do think that there are resources there to help, guide you.
Yeah, it's a good question, but a difficult question. Like a lot of it, I think, like you said, it's an ongoing process, and it depends at what age that point hits you, where you actually need to find that connection with some sort of, with your African heritage, or be it some sort of, if you're looking for something else, I guess, which is what happens to a lot of people. I guess it depends also how that moment occurs. If it is through an overt, and we don't want to go into racism in any detail, but if it is through some sort of overt moment where you are racialised, and you then have to self-reflect upon your own identity and who you are, and if you've grown up in a society where you feel like you're actually already part of that as a society. I'd imagine that a lot of kids that grow up here in Australia that haven't been over to Africa and haven't had the luxury to travel, my guess for the better part would see themselves as being locally born and Australian. I mean, they wouldn't really need to question otherwise. I think the way that this Australian society works and the education systems and everything else and the media and whichever really puts that out there, and it allows us to develop as autochthonous Australians, like we were born here. So it depends at what point that need to actually start to identify as other or something else begins, and how that begins, I think, is part of how you would actually go about seeking that cultural reinforcement. It really is a tricky one. I think today, in today's global world, that it's actually quite immediate to be able to access those resources. A lot of young people will do that through, and I guess a lot of people do that through popular culture. really, even if they're born here and grown up here. And even if I go to my own experiences of some of the young people that I've worked with, that questioning begins, and you start reflecting in the media and popular culture upon those elements of popular culture that you can relate to. And I guess, you'll find young people that will have posters of black cultural icons that they actually relate to, and they look into black music and literature, post-colonial literature, if you like, and they seek out those resources that help them to identify and to reaffirm who they are. It's a more difficult challenge when you actually don't have the resources to travel and you feel the sense of isolation. I guess that's a trickier one. So again, how that happens and how people can work with that outside of popular culture. I think there are pockets in Australia where we talk about multiculturalism, and there is a black Australia, albeit Indigenous or Indian, Malaysian, Bangladesh, etc. And I find some young people, I can even think of my daughter in one instance, that they will actually gravitate towards maybe not particularly African groupings per se, but other groupings where they have a shared sort of emotional and embodied experience, where they can actually share the same feelings of what it's like to be different, I guess, against a white cultural sort of norm. So I think, my hope, I guess, when I look at some of the research that I do, is that we get to a point in our understanding of multiculture where young people can actually interact with one another in this sort of organic space where they're not always reflecting against a more dominant culture, where that sort of experiences of their sense of who they are can be discovered and explored with other young people. But it doesn't necessarily mean, because of the resources, they can go back to their country or their parents' country of origin. I really think that we have the opportunity in Australia, and that's one of my bugbears, is that I think Australia has the potential to really offer a space in which that cultural exploration can happen, and where young people can actually intermix in an organic sort of multiculture and not have to rely so much on this, even though I know the diaspora is quite important. But I still think that because of the resources, we need to furbish a more organic sort of environment in which we can do that exploration and not feel threatened by doing it. I think especially in a post-9/11 environment, there is a period there where there was the threat of those sort of solidarities with other non-whites, that if you actually try and align with certain cultural groups, you feel yourself to be pressured or, perhaps being under the spotlight, so to speak, I guess is my way of saying it, that you feel a bit like you've got to be cautious about the associations you make. And without the ability to travel, which I think everyone should have the opportunity to do, then I think that's really one of the only ways it can happen. I have a sister that was actually born here in Australia from a half-sister, and she actually has never been to Africa. She grew up here in Melbourne, in St Kilda. And for her experience is significantly different to my own in terms of her understanding. Well, I guess just in that she, I guess it's significantly different to her own, that I would say that she still harbours a lot of the quintessential Australian characteristics, as opposed to the characteristics of being a little bit more Pan-African or sort of maybe even more of a sort of global citizen type exercise that a lot of us that have the opportunity to travel might see ourselves as.
But is that the expectation, that if you are from the African diaspora or from African descent, that you should have that level of awareness of,
I think that for the young people that have arrived here recently, more so, I think there is an expectation that you need to identify with a Pan-African sort of orientation, that you need to be part of this African diaspora if you want to identify as African Australian even, or should have some sort of cultural claim to an African identity, and understanding of that. And I found with the young people that I worked with, there was tensions around that, because some people would say, I think one of the guys I started use the term Australian African, not African Australian, because you were born here, so you're Australian African. I think there is an expectation amongst the diaspora that you invest in the diaspora and that you are part of it. And that's why I sort of revert back to the idea of a multiculture, where it's an intermixture of ethnicities, and that we don't really sort of have to totally invest in a diaspora because we might not have the resources to do so. And for my sister, for example, who grew up here, again, like I said before, it depends at that point where you feel like you need to seek some sort of other form of identity. And I don't think she's ever really got to that point of a critical point where she just said, I've got to go and travel Africa, I've got to go and meet my family, etc. Thankfully for her, a lot of us travelled here. Even my brothers that were born in Zimbabwe have travelled here. I've got a very complex family structure, by the way. Even a lot of my brothers that were born in Zimbabwe they've come out here and studied, and so she's met the family because the family has slowly sort of trickled into Australia and then back out again. So, I guess maybe in that sense it wasn't her own resources, but the family sort of came to her. So she's been lucky in that sense.
What about for you, Monica? You mentioned before that one of the issues that you've struggled negotiating living in Melbourne is the sense of, you've mixed heritage, Ghanaian, Australian, you've opened yourself to the African diaspora at large, but you were saying that sometimes it's a bit confronting when people expect you to know everything about Africa and you're like, well, I'm still trying to figure out my own little pocket.
Yeah, I know that when I was collecting tickets at the Ghanaian event and he started speaking in Twi and I didn't respond. And he's like, why don't you speak blah, 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 blah. You have to, you're Ghanaian. And I was like, well, it's not really my fault. My dad never taught us the language. So at times you feel like you're not a good Ghanaian for not being able to understand those things. And when I went back home, they said the same thing. I'm like, Dad, we have to learn the language. But I know that my sister, she doesn't struggle with the same issues I do. Like, she doesn't really care less. Like, she knows that she's a black woman, but does she want to engage in the African community? Not really. So I'm not sure why I feel this self-pressure to want to fit in, but maybe it's because I was the first one at primary school that was dark and I just felt different all the time, and she saw me, so she didn't really feel as different. So
it's interesting you mentioned that when you went back home you mean in Ghana.
Yeah, Ghana.
So you consider yourself belonging to two homes.
Yeah, like I'm really proud Ghanaian. Like, yeah, I rep Ghana all day. Like, if you're going to choose in the soccer, Australia or Ghana, I'll go Ghana. I'm really, really proud to be both heritage, like, from both sides. But I know that, like, a few years ago, my mum got really upset. She's like, you can't deny your white side. And I'm like, why? I live in Australia. And she actually started crying. And it was the first time I felt really bad, because sometimes I feel like you're expected to just be black all the time. And I kind of did leave my white side a bit, and yeah, this is when I was in high school and stuff, and I just saw how upset it made her, and I'm like, no, I have a really rich white heritage as well. Like, we've got pirates in our family, and a family member actually brought Chinese to Adelaide during the gold rush when it was illegal to bring Chinese people in. So like, we have like a really cool family history as well, and I'm super proud of my white family as well. But I think in trying to find out who I was, I neglected that side, and I went through my Pan-African stage. I went to Rutgers in New Jersey to study black history and black politics and trying to understand myself a bit better. And then I kind of just got to the point where it was really interesting and I learnt so much, but it wasn't really my story, it wasn't my history, and yeah, I just learnt a lot about other people, and it didn't really figure out my questions as such. I thought it would. I think as a mixed race person, or at least for me anyway, I'm always trying to search for the answer, and I feel like I'm always trying to put myself in a box. Like, when I was younger, I don't know how many times I cried to my mum wanting to get my hair relaxed to look like the other black girl. And my mum's like, no, you've got beautiful hair. I'm like, no, I want to look like that black girl. And I want to have darker skin. And even when I was looking at foundations, I used to choose like 4 or 5 shades darker than what I was. Like, I just didn't know who I was, because the only black person I saw was like, I don't know, a cousin or something, a Ghanaian cousin. He was a lot darker than me, so I never saw anything that looked like me. So I think, yeah, my sister doesn't struggle with the identity issue as much as I do, and sometimes I kind of wish, like, why do I care so much about being black or being African when she doesn't? Because it almost causes more trouble, or she's like blissfully, not ignorant, but she just doesn't care. And at times I wish like I didn't care either, but do you feel like it's a little bit of a burden sometimes? Sometimes, because as much as you try to identify yourself as a African Australian or biracial or whatever, sometimes I feel like full Africans, if you want to call it that way, won't accept you regardless. So within the African Australian community, you still feel like you don't necessarily belong, like in certain pockets? Yeah, definitely. I remember I was at Pentecostal church, and one girl's like, I hate mixed race people, they're so disgusting and stuff. And I was like, she knows that I'm mixed and I'm not sure, maybe she didn't like me for other reasons, which is probably true. But I just remember being like really hurt by those comments and just looks, and I don't know. Like, I think every mixed race person feels that way. Like, my sister says, oh, all generalizations, but like all black girls think that I'm stuck up and blah, blah, blah. And like guys will say, oh, she's stuck up. Like, they don't think that mixed race kids want to engage. But I kind of feel like, at least for me, sometimes you might be a little bit shy because the door's not always readily open. You're never going to be considered Ghanaian, even though that's what you are, like, what part of us is. And Yeah, I know that not that many mixed race people go to Ghanaian events. My sister and I are like the anomaly. So,
What about for you, Soreti? Do you sort of see that disparity within the African Australian community where certain groups feel like they identify closer to each other, and does that have anything to do with the geography, perhaps, or even racial or religious background?
Yeah, definitely. I think before we even get to the way that it's segregated based on the way that you look, I think in itself, it wasn't until I took it on myself to become more involved in the African community holistically in a more Pan-African sense that I even came in contact with Africans who are not, forget Ethiopian, just Oromo, full stop. And so I think there's already, in the way that our diasporas are created, they are quite segregated from one another. And for many reasons, maybe it's coincidental. I think also it comes in the idea of diasporas are a lot of the time created, I feel, to keep what we bring here, so language, culture, and sometimes keeping it separate from what could become intermixed and what could, also put that cultural practice in jeopardy, we steer clear of. I think in terms of what you were talking about, Monica, and the way that a lot of people view those who are mixed race or other, but are identifying as Black or African, it comes down to, I feel, a lack of understanding in terms of what it means to be a Black or African person. For me, I feel like if you are, I think you're African if you identify with it historically, you know what I mean? If your lineage is African, you are African, whether that's your mixed race, or not. And I think self-identification comes into it as well. If you, Monica will stand up and tell me I'm a Black African woman, then I see you as a Black African woman, despite the way that you may look. And I remember I read somewhere, I don't know if it was a quote or in a poem or something, but within Blackness you can find every colour. And so Blackness for me goes past skin colour. Actually, skin colour is probably the most minimal thing I consider when thinking about a Black person or Blackness. And also I think there's a difference between a racial identity and a cultural identity, and coming to terms with one doesn't necessarily mean that you come to terms with the other. And that comes back to what you were talking about with popularised Black culture and you identifying in the context of a global Black community or a national Black community in terms of Indigenous Australia doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to also identify with your cultural African background, whether that be Ghanaian, Oromo, or whatever. I think the two come very separately and are triggered by different things. And so I don't know what the question was anymore, but I think what I'm trying to say is there are a lot of ways to identify with a lot of different things. But I think I think the Pan-African thing is a very interesting topic, and the way that Pan-Africanism manifests itself in a diaspora context and what it looks like, in a continent, on the continent. As an Oromo, I think it's really interesting because I think colonially, on a post-colonial context, it's very easy for Africans to identify what went wrong with the enemy in terms of in a colonial view, because often that enemy was foreign or was white. Whereas in Ethiopia, as an Oromo, my enemy, for lack of a better term, is Black, and is African or identifies as African. And so that as well is quite I don't even know, man. It's just interesting. A lot of these things are very, very interesting. And so, like I said, I don't know what the question was, but I'm trying to make a really great point right now, which I hope you all resonate with.
Well, I have just one more question, because I should open the floor up to questions very shortly. So if you just put your hand up, one of the lovely ushers will come over and take your question. But my question is, how do we empower young, you mentioned your daughter, Kirk, the generations that are growing up now, how do we empower them so they don't have to seek as much as you guys have had to through the experiences that you shared in order to feel like they belong?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were just talking about, that it's really early days, I would say. I think there's a lot of inter-ethnic and interracial, if you like, conflict within Black communities at times. We've only been the community's only really been occurring and growing in the last decade or so, realistically, or to get to a point of what we might call critical mass. So I think it's really early days, to tell you the truth. Whether we refer to this idea of African Australian identity or whether it becomes Black Australians or whatnot, it's hard to tell. We were discussing earlier in Britain, for example, how it's like Black Britons, and there's not this idea of African English and so on and so forth, because they've had a longer history. and there's more generations there, and they've started to create their own culture and their own vernacular. And really, I think within a context.
Do you think that's what we need?
Well, I think it's inevitable.
Yep.
I mean, my children, their mother's Spanish, for example, so they're very complex in terms of trying to identify, and they're quite well grounded in the Spanish diaspora, but know very little of the African side. So, and again, I just sort of think that eventually, that we get to a point where it just becomes more normalised. Maybe it won't be African-Australian identity per se, but where there is more of solidarity or more of an understanding of black or non-white cultures is just more integral to Australian society, and that stems inevitably into popular culture and media and music and literature and so on and so forth. But I think Australia, it's such an early time. Like, it's really, really early now, sort of in that development. We still, I think, in this country have those pockets of communities as well, be it Vietnamese, Lebanese, so on and so forth. So I still think there's a lot of work to be done, and so it's hard to say what's the way forward. It's just, I think, everyone just contributing and collaborating around these sort of ideas as we're doing today, and just trying to push that sort of agenda, for use of a better word, to push it forward. I don't think there's a magic bullet. You could look at education, if you like, how the way the education system works. Is there sufficient sort of curricula that represents Indigenous, non-Indigenous, non-Anglo-Saxon cultures, etc.? And there's room to be done in education, for example. There's a lot of pockets where we could really sort of point the finger if we like. So, I think it's just going to be about time, and again, just keep pushing these discussions and this agenda.
For me, I think empowerment is very synonymous with self-awareness, and it's less for me to do with what do you give someone to feel empowered, but more so to do with saying I will not cripple your growth in any aspect. And then I think that empowerment comes almost not naturally, but it comes easier. As Monica mentioned before, your mother saying to your mother you wanted to relax your hair. My hair was relaxed since it grew from my head until
I'll just explain what relaxing hair is for those people that may not understand. It's essentially when you chemically straighten your hair. So you essentially destroy the curls, the beautiful curls from your head.
And so even I started growing my hair naturally from the age of 18, and I had not it's a phenomenon to some, but it's a reality for others. The process of growing natural hair, it was the crux of my own identity crisis and my own navigation of identity. And so these things, I think, generationally will change. So I know now that I will not relax my daughter's hair. If she grows up at the age of 18, she wants to relax her hair, and she has come to that decision herself, then that's her decision. But I won't cripple her ability to identify with her blackness, with her Oromo-ness, or with her Australianness if she chooses. But I also present the facts to her or him or whoever it is, in terms of the kind of Australia they live in, that historical sense of Australia, the present Australia, and what potentially the future Australia could look like. And so for me, it comes to, I feel like in my life there is a lot that has not been transparent about myself, about the way the world views me, and I feel like that's something that I'm going to be taking on, and I feel like our generation is going to be taking on in moving forward.
I'll keep it short and sweet. I agree with what both of you guys have said. I think empowerment will come through just seeing a change in society, like on TV, who's presenting the news. Will it be Santilla? Or even Nuala Hafner on Channel 7. I didn't know she was mixed race. So probably people that are of different heritages, just saying that you are, and just making us feel more normal and normalised in society. And I just think all those shifts, like people in different jobs and just on TV and music, and seeing differences in skin colours, I think will make it a lot easier for mixed race people, or just people that identify from any cultural heritage, to feel more a part of Australia when Australian media and that want to include us in whatever they perceive as Australianness.
All right, well, on that note, we'll take some questions. Is there anyone?
Hello. Hi. So you talked about Pan-Africanism when identifying yourself. When you identify as being Pan-African, do you risk co-opting struggles of other Black or African people?
Are you asking me?
I think it's
to everyone, or to Soreti, or to Kirk, or Monica, whoever wants to take it. Hot potato.
Wait, can I clarify something though before you? When you say other Black or African people, I'm black and I'm just confused as to like who you're.
So you're saying with the Pan-African, sort of adopting a sort of Pan-African approach, do you risk, did you say...
Do you risk, I guess, co-opting struggles of other African or black people, however they identify?
Yes, I guess so, is a simple answer. Going back to the 60s, I think Indigenous struggles in the 60s used to appropriate African-American sort of freedom movements to empower themselves and to sort of create a groundswell for Indigenous rights. So I think any sort of black movement or Pan-African movement should reciprocate and draw on other movements realistically. I think the Oromo example is a tricky one. If you're trying to create this big Pan-African umbrella, but then within that Pan-African sort of orientation, there's underlying conflicts. So what happens then in terms of whose voice is really being represented in that Pan-African sort of approach and that Pan-African identity? So, I think yes is probably the short answer to your question, that you are going to reciprocate and draw on other struggles, and then there are going to be voices that might actually get silenced in taking this sort of a larger sort of Pan-African approach, yes.
I think in a similar vein, I think yes, but at the same time, I feel like the way that Pan-Africanism manifests in the diaspora, although is very similar theoretically to what it looks like on the continent, I think is also very different. I think there was a statistic of some sort that measured the amount of money diaspora sent back to the African continent that was almost as much or even more than what is sent through government or non-government aid, and I think this in itself is a way where we're seeing economically an idea or ideology of Pan-Africanism coming to life, and so I think it'll take on different forms that were not theorized or were not touched on when Pan-Africanism was coming to fruition when it began, and it'll also take from and replicate and if you want to use the word appropriate those kind of past ideologies of Pan-Africanism. I don't know why, but I feel really uncomfortable with the idea of co-opt, because I think it's my view in terms of I see the black community as being really one in all of its difference, and I want that. I say that because I feel like that's the kind of future I want to see, and so I'm trying to manifest that in my mind now. And so I feel a bit uncomfortable with the term co-ops, because I don't feel like it's coming at the detriment of that people group if we are very, very careful.
Any other questions? Yep.
Hi, I've just moved here from the UK a few months ago.
Welcome.
So, hi. So, in London, where I grew up, the predominant sort of African identities are usually Ghanaian and Nigerian. So one of the things that I'm sort of struggling with here, well, not struggling with because I love everyone, but there aren't that many Ghanaian and Nigerian identities. So I asked one of my friends where I can buy some hair. She sent me to Footscray. So I went into Footscray, and it's all like a lot of Ethiopian shops, a lot of Somalian shops, and I'm like, oh, this isn't the same. This isn't. So a couple of points is similar to what Monica was saying. While I'm here, I self-identify as a British Ghanaian, but here that identity sort of erased. I'm just British. So people would I remember the other day it was a little bit chilly and I was wearing a hoodie, and someone goes, "Oh, you're English. You should be out in jeans and a t-shirt." And I was like, "Am I English?" Whereas in the UK, I've had comments before like, "Oh, you're used to the heat anyway," sort of thing, So it happens. So whereas here, what I'm trying to say is, how would you recommend sort of connecting with my Ghanaianness and Africanness when it's something I don't really interact with on a daily basis?
Yeah, I can tell you that there's a very large and active Nigerian community and a Ghanaian community, and they put on a lot of events in the city.
Okay, so, good events.
Where can I buy plantain?
Definitely.
That's the main plantain.
Where can you buy what?
Well, my housemate's Nigerian. You can just come over, to be honest.
Wonderful. Okay.
But
that's another thing. Like even something as small as, whereas in London, I can just walk out in the street and hear people speaking and then it's sort of, that makes me comfortable. I literally have not heard one person speaking tree on the streets, which is fine, but it's just, the more I think about it, the stranger it is. to me, where I've grown up in an area where there's a lot of, so it's just like, especially without family here, it's just really difficult to sort of, and as well, it's not like, your TV's very white, let's be honest. So there's nobody, again, that I can really sort of visually connect with either,
Well, I can't help you with the TV diversity business.
No one can help
But I can help you with contacts and where to find plantains and and everything. So I can definitely hook you up if you come up.
But
and
just
there's
even
a Ghana association as well, so
Okay.
I'm the youth committee member, so please join.
I will.
And you can buy plantain, and you can go to
Wonderful.
West African hair salons in Braybrook and Sunshine and Reservoir. There's heaps of places. Talk to me later.
Okay, I will. I'll find you.
Yeah.
But yeah, just even how important is it to connect to something on a daily basis when you're sort of not reminded of it? Because I just feel on a daily basis I'm just British here. I don't really think about my Ghanaian heritage while I'm here, except for when I speak to my mum.
I think that's...
And is that even important?
I think it's really important. I mean, I now live in Footscray, and there's a huge Oromo Ethiopian community. And it was before I lived in Footscray, I lived in Burwood, and before I lived in Burwood, I lived at home. So when I was at home, I would speak Oromo at home constantly, and my Oromo was very, very strong. I felt like when I left home and I was not amongst my community on a daily basis, or it wasn't being triggered on a daily basis, I could already see the difference in my fluency in being able to speak Oromo and the like. Now living in Footscray, every single day when I walk down Nicholson Street, I'm saying hi to somebody in Oromo. I'm just constantly reminded of my Oromo-ness, and I think it's very, very important. I personally don't know where you can find that in that magnitude, like you're explaining as you saw in London. I don't think that you find it in that. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't know. Maybe there are places I've never been to in Melbourne.
Yeah, in London you can buy palm oil at like the milk bar, and I thought that was really, really weird. Yeah, the supermarket. Yeah, very
Okay,
different.
so we'll take a couple more questions. Yep.
Hi, I was born in Zimbabwe. I came here when I was 8, and I'm 18 now. And although I've never felt particularly Australian, being a white, or like mostly white person from a post-colonial country, I find it really difficult, or I feel like I don't have the right to call myself Zimbabwean. And I've certainly met a lot of Africans who have talked to me and who have looked at me and who have not seen anything that is anything like what they are. So could you maybe comment on that facet of African identity?
That's a tricky one. Look, I mean, I have looked more at what we call sub-Saharan or Black African identity with the people that I've worked with. And I guess it was what I mentioned before, like I think especially for white Africans that have come across, and there is a large enough population, that, it is difficult. And I think it probably will be for it's inevitable, really. I think with colonisation and apartheid in South Africa, and just the way that the black identity or African identity has been shaped primarily around a black identity. I think the way we discuss it and the way we use it. I guess question to yourself if you really need to. I mean, you yourself want to affiliate and identify as Zimbabwean, I'm assuming. So in doing that, what sort of surroundings allows you to identify? Is it with other black Zimbabweans? Is it with other white Zimbabweans? And where do you feel that need to identify, I guess, all I can offer is some suggestions around how to negotiate that. But I can imagine it's a very difficult space. But like I said, even when I went to Zimbabwe as a little kid, I'd get called gollywog and treated as different and the like as well. I don't have any really clear-cut sort of, suggestions or answers for you on that one. It is a tricky one. This side of the table?
I think you should identify whichever way you choose to identify. I guess if you were born in America but your parents were from some other country, you might say you're American even though people don't perceive you to be something. So I guess if you understand it via that context, it's kind of no different. If you're born in Zimbabwe, and a lot of white South Africans I've met, or white people from Southern Africa, at university, some of them like, but I'm a third generation, I'm a fourth generation. So it kind of seems a bit mean of me to take away their Africanness just because I don't think that they're black enough to be African, but that's a different. Yeah.
But how do you sort of navigate that identity? Because she's clearly proud of her Zimbabwean heritage, and she still wants to hold on to that. But if she's entering a space where, you know, black Zimbabweans might not necessarily feel like she is part of that, or not even just black Zimbabweans, but black Africans in general, how do you then begin to create an identity while still living here in Australia?
Just coming to mind for me, even like when I was here, people would say, "Where are you from?" And I'd say, "Well, yeah, I was born here, but my father's Zimbabwean." I mean, it's just the reverse, really, in many ways. When people say that to you here, well, I live here. I was born in Zimbabwe. Again, if you have that need to identify in a nationalistic sense, like that you are Zimbabwean, then nothing should preclude you from doing that. If you're born there and that's your birthright, for use of a better term. But again, it just comes back to, and again, if you went to the African Australian Studies, what's the name of it?
My student organisation.
Yeah, again,
ASO,
yeah. So are you allowed? Can you get into and can you be part of those organisations that are centred around sort of African heritage? And does being white preclude you? Have you tried? I guess that's what it comes down to as well. And do you want to affiliate with those organisations?
Just one quick. I'm never one to decide on someone else's experience, but I think there, in my own experience with people who have asked similar questions to what you've asked, one thing that I feel like would be interesting for yourself, if you haven't already, to reflect on is, I think in the context of a lot of black Africans, black Zimbabweans who may move quickly to exclude you from identifying with that Africanness, is because for you, maybe there is more than one thing that you can hold to be yours, being of a white Zimbabwean. But for a lot of Zimbabweans, that Zimbabwean identity is kind of, all they have, or what they hold close, what they identify closest to. And also what your physical appearance or your whiteness or your ability to move freely in the rest of the world represents to them. And a lot of the time that's repression and oppression. There are a lot of questions to ask, I think. I'm not a white Zimbabwean, so I don't know, but I think there are a couple questions, and from a lot of different angles and a lot of different perspectives take into account.
Yeah. Do we have time for one more question? Yeah? Just one more last question. Yep. Over there.
Good evening. Thank you. Hey. I'm actually from Zimbabwe. I'm a black Zimbabwean, so hey, sister, what's up?
Hey!
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, the one that came before. I just want to comment on that first before I ask my question about Pan-Africanism and how we define Pan-Africanism in the 21st century context, because it has been a shifting sort of ideology in philosophy and movement. So I think as Zimbabweans, and I think you would agree, we've got a very specific way of relating to each other. We've got our own language that we speak. There's a certain slang that comes out when you're amongst Zimbabweans. So it doesn't matter whether you're Indian, it doesn't matter whether you're white, it doesn't matter whether you're black. If you're raised like post 1980, after segregation, etc., you do behave in a certain way. So I feel your pain. I went to Switzerland as an exchange student with a girl whose parents were white farmers, and she looked Swedish. So every time the Swiss would look at her and they go, "You're not Zimbabwean, you're not African," which is kind of strange, because if I felt homesick, I'd call Charmaine, like, "Chick, we need to catch up," we need to catch up. So I think I love this discussion, but I would also like it to be focused on the specific experiences of people in sub-Saharan Africa and the experiences that we've had in negotiating our racial past, and the efforts that we're making on the ground, grassroots, as people to connect with one another despite what we hear on the news. So Pan-Africanism, I'm just going to do a plug, if I may. I'm curious about this question because I've recently started a poetry storytelling session called the Pan-African Poets Cafe, because I'm curious and I want to discover what Pan-Africanism means for us in the 21st century as Africans who are creative, and creative in the real sense of being people who are going to take whatever it is that life hands us and create our identity, because identity is not something that's fixed. And I'm always concerned when we start to respond or create our identities in response to a colonial history that is based on the need to fight against a system that wanted to suppress people, for want of a better word. And we often forget that there was real agency exercised by people on the ground at a particular time, and they still sought to connect. So, for instance, in South Africa, you found the jazz musicians in shebeens, you know, and there you found a lot of people of different colors, different races interacting despite what the government wanted and was trying to impose upon people. So what I want to say is there a way of defining African identity in a way in which we celebrate it, and we celebrate it as something that constantly shifts and changes and adapts and has agency?
Kirk?
Yeah. Well, obviously, yeah. I mean, really, that's sort of all there is in many ways, is it always will be fluid, always will shift and always adapt. But your question goes to how do we celebrate it, was it? How do we, well, I think you've already pointed out a couple of good examples, really, and whether or not that continues and whether you're asking if that's possible in a country like Australia for that to happen. Is it something that has to happen spontaneously and that happens from below, or is it something that's organised and structured, preferably the former, that it's something that emerges as these spontaneous eruptions of creativity and of solidarity, and that lends itself to that sort of resistance? But I don't like to think of it always working against a white norm, or always working against a structure that sort of has to be, that we have to be suppressed to find that creativity. And I think that's sort of what you were semi-alluding to. So not. So that to me is where it would work most creatively, where it just can actually happen quite organically. And it's because as people of African heritage, we want to actually create that music, like you said, poetry and so on and so forth, and allow that to actually to emerge. And I'd imagine you guys would probably have similar or same opinions, whether or not you want to relate that to previous sort of Pan-African sort of movements. Again, because you've said you don't see it as being against I think the previous sort of ideas that you've raised, and even like negritude, like they're working against a sort of a black, against a racist structure and trying to find voice and agency against that. So that's only my question, where I'm sort of not quite,
I think, we're running out of time, unfortunately. We're Okay, do you know what? Perhaps if you stay back and then you can chat to Kirk about it, and then you might be able to get some answers to that question. But in the meantime, I just wanted to say a massive thank you to everyone who came out tonight for the first of the Africa Talk series. Hopefully we'll see you in a month for the second one, which is Africa is Not a Country, and that's looking at how the media reports on and reflects on the African Australian community and also the African continent. But before that, I'd just like to say a massive thank you to the panellists, Monica Forson, Soreti Kadir and Kirk Zwangobani.